U.S. releases guidance addressing sanction evasion practices in maritime, energy, and metal trading sector. On May 14, the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Asset Control (OFAC), and the U.S. Coast Guard issued a sanction advisory for the maritime industry, the energy and metal sector, and related business communities to provide guidance regarding illicit shipping and sanction evasion practices. The advisory focused on practices to combat sanction evasion, smuggling, and criminal activity, facilitation of terrorism, and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction (WMD), particularly in the context of activities involving Iran, North Korea, and Syria. The advisory doesn't expand existing primary or sanction, but does provide important information about its awareness of common deceptive shipping practices and resets U.S. sanction compliance expectation in the maritime industry for transactions involving the energy and metal sector. The advisory defined the energy and metal sector to include trade in crude oil, refined petroleum, petrochemical, steel, iron, aluminum, copper, sand, and coal, and the affected stakeholders as ship owners, managers, operators, brokers, ship candles, flag registrars, port operators, shipping companies, freight forwarders, classification service providers, commodity traders, insurance companies, and financial institutions. The advisory states that it provides updated information on the deceptive practices used to evade sanction and practices that stakeholders may wish to consider adopting as a part of a risk-based sanction compliance program. In light of previous advisories listing vessels deemed to have engaged in sanctionable conduct and blocking sanctions imposed on numerous maritime companies and vessels, maritime industry participants should understand this expectation, evaluate them against current risk-based sanction compliance practices, and consider prompt implementation where appropriate. Deceptive shipping practices. The advisory summarizes a non-exhaustive list of tactics used by persons to facilitate illegal maritime trade or conduct. It recommends the maritime sector continue to be vigilant against this tactic to limit the risk of being involved in sanctionable or illicit conduct and to exercise heightened due diligence with respect to shipments that transit areas that present high risk. The tactics include disabling or manipulating the automatic identification system (IAS) on vessel, physically altering vessel identification, falsifying cargo and vessel documents, ship-to-ship SDS transfer, voyage irregularities, false flag and flag hopping, complex ownership or management. None of this tactic is entirely new. However, the list should be viewed as a consolidated red flag checklist that U.S. authorities are likely to expect parties to observe or uncover through heightened due diligence, in particular in higher risk transactions. Conversely, failure to detect deceptive practices as a result of not implementing guidance provided in the advisory may serve as a basis for regulatory scrutiny and adverse action. Thus, the advisory effectively puts all stakeholders on notice that heightened vigilance is required to avoid inadvertent illegal activity when one or more of these factors is present, especially in the context of a transaction that may directly or indirectly involve Iran, Syria, or North Korea. Best practices to identify sanction evasion. The advisory details 7 practices that may assist in more effectively identifying potential sanction evasion. Those practices, which the advisory warns are not intended to be comprehensive, are as follows. institutionalized sanction-compliant program. The advisory recommend companies conduct a risk assessment and develop adequate and appropriate compliance policies that respond to the internal risk assessment and provide specific guidance on how that may be accomplished. These include, but is not limited to, implementing sanction compliance and due diligence program and the provision of training and resources needed to execute those programs. It also provides guidance suggesting that companies communicate their compliance policies and expectations to affiliate, partner, and various counterparts in a manner consistent with local requirements, which may include so-called blocking regulation. Establish AIS best practices and contractual requirements. The advisory encouraged maritime industry participants, flag registrars, and other private sector entities to include insurers and financial institutions that conduct business with ship owners, charterers, and managers to promote continuous broadcasting of AIS as a carriage requirement consistent with the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, particularly in high-risk areas. Additionally, the advisory encouraged companies to investigate whether there has been a prior history of AIS transponder manipulation before engaging in a transaction and consider amending contract to include termination language if AIS location isn't continuously broadcast or cargoes are transferred illicitly. Monitor ship throughout the entire transaction life cycle. The advisory encouraged ship owners, managers, and charter companies to monitor their vessel to ensure continuous AIS broadcasting and whether any STS transfer are undertaken where appropriate based on risk. In addition, prior to STS transfer, vessel operators are advised to consider verifying the other vessel's name, IMO number, and flag and checking that it is currently broadcasting AIS. Industry actors are also encouraged to look for situations where ownership of a vessel has recently changed hands without alteration of the ultimate beneficial owner. Know your customer and counterparty. The advisory encourages stakeholders such as flag registry administration, insurers, financial institutions, managers, and charterers to conduct appropriate risk-based due diligence. The advisory suggests due diligence practices such as reviewing the name, passport ID numbers, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, and copies of photo identification of each customer's beneficial owners.